Professor Muqtedar, who will present on the sustainable development in the subject area. You will have 20 minutes for presentation. Please welcome Professor Muqtedar Khan.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to all of you. And I begin in the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate, who is also the embodiment of peace and the embodiment of love. I want to thank Dr. Ratri Kandrasari for inviting me, and I want to also thank the deans and the president, the vice president, and the chairs and faculty of the university, so that I really want to appreciate the faculty of Malikussaleh in Aceh, Indonesia, for hosting this conference. And I think it is very interesting that you are having it at the same time that Bali is hosting the G20 summit. I want to begin by saying that because the nature of the conference is so broad, so you have people from various disciplines, not just social sciences, but also humanities, I have developed my presentation in broad strokes. So what I intend to do is talk to you about the future of sustainable development in this age of disruption that we live in. So I shall begin by talking about what is a disruption and what are the symptoms of disruption that we are experiencing today. And then I will try and talk about the sources and causes of this global disruption. And then finally, I will talk about the trends that we are going to see in the future, which hopefully will address these sources of disruption and then restore the world on the path to sustainable development. I also want to congratulate Indonesia as a country for the amazing progress that it has done in two areas. One in the area of economic development with special focus on sustainable development. I also want to congratulate Indonesia for essentially debunking this myth that Islam and democracy are not compatible. So the growth of democracy, the growth of pluralism, the growth of religious tolerance in Indonesia continues to signal that there are interpretations of Islam which are compatible with modernity, compatible with democracy, compatible with pluralism and multi-religious societies. So on that score also I would like to congratulate Indonesia. I was in Indonesia a couple of years ago. That's where I got this cap of mine. I bought it when I spoke at the Gajah Mada University 2 years ago. So I identify three types of symptoms of disruption in the world. The first is something that everybody is talking about, shortages due to supply chain disruptions. So we're looking at shortages of food, shortages of fertilizers, shortage of what we would call as energy essentially, but fuel. So people talk in terms of 3 Fs, fuel, fertilizer, and food shortages. And what it is doing is for countries that are developing, the sudden disruption of essential supplies. If you don't have fertilizers, your agricultural industry will suffer. If you don't have food, then there is poverty. Suddenly, an experience of poverty, suffering, malnutrition, deaths, and also leading to other aspects of underdevelopment. It increases crime, etc. So the shortage of food is also extremely detrimental to society. Then the countries have to spend much more than they have budgeted on just basic needs of the society in buying food and trying to make sure that the population is not starving. So imagine that you are investing in, say, hydroelectric power or green energy, and suddenly you are confronted with a situation where your population is suffering from hunger all of a sudden because supply chains have been disrupted and you have restructured your economy in such a way because of globalization that you are now dependent on faraway countries or on food supply. And then now you are spending a lot of money on food supply. So that means that the investments that you were trying to make, say, in green energy or hydroelectric energy, is now diverted towards essentially meeting basic needs of food for the population. So this is one of the global symptoms. So it is being discussed quite seriously in Bali during the G20 summit as to how to ensure that these supplies are not disrupted. The supplies are not only disrupted, but there is also a kind of global inflation taking place. And as a result of the global inflation, even countries which may be able to have access to food, say from neighboring countries, may not be able to afford that. Food, fuel, and fertilizers, they may not be able to afford any of these things because of the high cost of doing that. And for those who are in the fortunate position of being able to produce this and are able to sell this on the market, may decide to sell them to faraway countries where they will be able to get more money. So inflation is also causing a disruption to supplies and also causing a disruption to developmental projects of developing countries. So it is very important to understand that these shortages that we are experiencing, especially in the area of energy and food, and fertilizer is part of it, is very, very critical. It should not be taken lightly. It could reverse the progress of economic development and growth of countries. The second thing that you see is population displacement. Population displacement. And population displacements are basically two types: international migration and domestic displacement inside, as a result of climate change, as a result of supply shortages, etc. So this is one of the biggest challenges going forward, because there are large migrations taking place. People going from North Africa to Europe, for example. You have seen people migrating across countries. So these are some of the challenges that are going to be causing lots of disruptions. And if you have large-scale migration, then it causes domestic upheaval. So, for example, the large-scale migration from Middle East to Europe has in some ways triggered the rise of right-wing parties, triggered the rise of populist leaders who are undermining democracies. So what happens is, because of climate change, because of shortages of food, because of poor economic development, there is mass migration, and then this mass migration disrupts the host societies, which then become anti-immigration, xenophobic, Islamophobic, and so on. So the population displacements and internal migration are also one of the most important and perhaps a long-term source of disruption in countries' progress towards sustainable goals and to achieve sustainable development. Even wealthy countries may struggle to cope with it. For example, if you could take the case of Turkey, which had to host Syrian migrants and refugees. Remember, Pakistan had to host millions of refugees from Afghanistan, Rohingya refugees going across into Bangladesh. So these large number of refugees then have put stress on domestic economy and also disrupt the trajectory of these nations' development, especially if these are developing countries or low-income economies. And the third form of symptom of this global disruption is the sudden talk and recognition that perhaps we are seeing the end of the age of globalization. One of the consequences of the age of globalization, which is, say, from the 80s onwards till now, was the enormous the world did become capitalistic. There were lots of billionaires that were produced. But if you just look at India and China, these two countries, you could argue that nearly 1 billion people have come out of poverty as a result of this globalization, essentially. So some countries have benefited significantly. It's unbelievable how rapid the development of East Asia and development of China, and now the rapid growth of India, which is now the fastest growing economy in the post-COVID era. So But suddenly we are now facing a moment in history. It's an inflection point where the trends could reverse, including the trend of globalization. So we have this challenge of the COVID pandemic. We have the challenge of the war, and so on. And all of these causes of this disruption may reverse globalization, and therefore there is talk of deglobalization. So, what will deglobalization do to those countries who are on the trajectory of development? What will it do to their goals of having sustainable development? The easiest way to understand sustainable development is basically that you have to keep in mind, can this be sustained over a period of time? Number one. Number two, does it do any damage to the climate? And if it is going to harm the climate in the process of developing the country, then we should find a way to develop the economy and the industry so that it does not continue to contribute to climate damage, but also find ways to develop which will not just not do damage to the climate, but also reverse the damage that has already been done to the climate. So now, with deglobalization, what happens to that sustainable development agenda? These are the questions that emerge from the symptoms that I have identified. So, what are the causes of these symptoms of disharm? I identified three causes, and there are four, but I've clubbed the last two as one. Clearly, the disruption that you see in the world supply chains, the disruptions that you see in developmental trajectories is because of climate. The rapidly deteriorating situation of the climate and the climate change is causing lots of problems. It is causing economic development to be reversed. It is causing large-scale migration and displacement of people, and I talked already about what it does to societies. Societies from where people are migrating are suddenly losing human resources, may lose their best people, may lose their elite, their educated scientists, etc. And so there is a brain drain taking place from these societies. And then the societies which suddenly receive an unexpectedly large population are suddenly socially, culturally, and politically also disrupted and insecure. One of the consequences, for example, one of the reasons for Brexit, for Britain leaving the European Union, was the fear of mass migration, particularly of Muslims and Middle Eastern people coming to Britain. And so one way they thought they could stem mass migration to Britain was by getting out of European Union. So you could see how European Union was also disrupted by these changes that are taking place. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic, clearly indicated that it can have a terrific impact. Nearly 6.5 million people died. Many economies suffered sustained, you could argue, negative growth. There was recession in many countries. And the bad news is that the pandemics are probably going to become more and more frequent in the next few years. So we can anticipate a pandemic every 4 to 5 years. That is the forecast of epidemiologists and people who study pandemics and epidemics. So we feel that that is going to remain a source. So any sustainable developmental projects and planning that we do, we have to keep mind or at least factor in for a possible impact of pandemics. So for example, if you're launching a major development project, which is, say, a duration of 10 years, then anticipate that at least once your efforts will be disrupted by a pandemic. We were not prepared for what happened with COVID. Hopefully, countries that were not able to manage their situation well have learned from those countries which were able to manage. And one of the things that the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, really emphasized was the need for cooperation between all countries, sharing of resources, sharing of scientific knowledge, and the rapid investment in scientific knowledge in order to do research, in order to deal with the new challenges that we face. So there is a need for more sustained and systematic cooperation in knowledge production across the world in order to preempt and deal with these pandemics. And the last two sources, which I've clubbed them in one, are war and shifts in the global order. So we have been enjoying a post World War II liberal order for the last 75 plus years, a liberal order that promotes democracy, promotes trade, promotes free markets and free societies, led by the United States and its allies. Yes, some countries have suffered from this international order. The Palestinians, for example, have remained without freedom in an order which values freedom. So the order is not perfect. It is hypocritical. We saw the response to Ukraine was so different from Russia's brutalities in, say, Chechnya or Syria. So yes, the system is not perfect, but it has provided an opportunity where we have enjoyed more or less global peace with no major wars like World War I or World War II. And we also have seen, as I already mentioned, tremendous prosperity, especially in Asia, especially in your part of the world. The reason why Obama started talking to pivot to Asia is because of the tremendous growth of Asian economies. Right now, in the top 5 economies, you have 3 Asian economies, which is China, Japan, and India, at 2, 3, at 2, 3, and 5th position. In less than 10 years, or not 10, but say by 2030 or 2040 for sure, Indonesia will be the 5th biggest economy. So you will have in the top 10 economies nearly 6 Asian economies, including Indonesia, Vietnam, and South Korea. So the balance of global power, economic power, is already shifting towards Asia. But the decline of the liberal order means that there are potentiality for a lot of global geopolitical competition. And you heard President Biden's speech at G20. He stopped short of claiming that a new Cold War has begun between the US and China. And I just want to take 1 second aside and ask a question to people who are here as to why is Indonesia not part of the so-called Quad? You're part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but you're not part of the Quad. Why isn't a 5-pronged, given the importance of Indonesia, which is also a democracy? Because Indonesia is hedging its bets and recognizes that China is a very important player in the region, and so it is trying to stay in between the US and China, especially given China's huge investments in Indonesia. So it is possible that the new global order may go back to a Cold War-like situation where the world is divided into democracies and autocracies, where the West is leading a democratic part of the world and China is leading an autocratic part of the world, and so there is some kind of a geopolitical competition. That would be devastating. That would not only undermine all the gains of globalization, but it could cause wars on the peripheries of these two spheres, and eventually lead to partition between East and West. Hopefully that will not happen. Both China and the United States, there will be wisdom that will prevail in both China and the United States, and we will see healthy competition in the area of economy and technology, but no military threats and no isolation of each other. So these are some of the challenges that I see are the sources of causing the disruptions that I was talking about. So how is the world going to deal with these challenges? So I submit to you that these are the 3 important trends that people in Asia in particular and rest of the world should pay attention to going forward, especially countries which are developing nations and which are focused on catching up with the developed world, who are interested in providing better quality of life to their citizens. And by better quality, I mean not just material, but political and cultural, provide them with freedoms to pursue their goals in lives, to define happiness as they choose, and also provide them with positive freedoms, which would mean that not only should they have the freedom to do what they want, but there should also be resources available to them to pursue those positive freedoms. So the 3 trends that I think are important or With the last one, you will see it's not exactly like a trend, but it's an opportunity. The first one is called minilateralism. Minilateralism is the alternative to global multilateralism, which means that you're going to see small clusters of countries working together to pursue a shared either geopolitical goal or economic goal. So if you look at the Quad has only 4 countries in it: India, the US, Australia, and Japan. These are also 3 of the top 5 economies, and Australia is not far behind. These are democracies which are aligning against China in some way, but they are also working together to keep the entire Indo-Pacific region free from any hegemonic control by China, and therefore providing a public good to other Asian countries so that they can trade freely and interact freely. So this is one example of a small group of countries coming together to form a minilateralism. Another case is I2U2, another initiative in which it is India, Israel, United States, and United Arab Emirates. So on the East Asia side, you see the Quad. On the West Asia side, you see I2U2. There are other collaborative minilateralisms that you can see, especially in your region. You also see it is something smaller than ASEAN. For sure, ASEAN is a regional organization, and I suspect the regional organizations will also become more powerful than global organizations. But you can see AUKUS, another of such minilateralism. So I have a feeling that we will see the emergence of many minilateral initiatives which are focused on specific things. And that will be one way in which it will be an alternative to globalization, and it will also be an alternative to global governance based from the United Nations or World Bank. The second trend, which is going to become very important, is friendshoring. Friendshoring is the alternative to offshoring. So in the past, one of the things that globalization did was many rich and developed countries simply sent their manufacturing abroad, say to China, and then they sent their offices abroad, business operating procedures, etc., to say India and Philippines, etc. So what was happening was that they were using the free market mechanisms of the global economy to reduce the cost of labor, essentially, and cost, and sometimes even to avoid complicated legal rules which would force companies to pay greater attention and therefore spend more on environmental issues. So offshoring was happening. But now, for example, if there is tensions between the United States and China, then what happens to the supply chain? China has been for the last 20 years the factory for the world and factory for the United States. A lot of things that we use in the US, like the laptop that I'm using is made in China. So if we have some hostile relationship with China, what is going to happen to that supply chain? And so we need to find a place which is as inexpensive, as good as China, but someone who is a friend whom we can trust. So, for example, the United States has shifted, the US company Apple has shifted the manufacturing of iPhone 14 from China to India. That is called friendshoring. In fact, Treasury Janet Yellen was in India 2 days ago before the beginning of the G20 summit to essentially promote offshoring, friendshoring in India, and say that, look, one advantage of having close friends and allies is that rather than investing in countries just based on low cost, we will now invest in countries based on low cost but also on reliability and friendship. So there is a new dimension to globalization. So what you might see is, instead of seeing a global world, you are going to see clusters of friends globally who will be cooperating through minilateralism, who will be sharing economic benefits. And so there will be clusters of growth. So it's quite possible that some clusters may grow and other clusters may not grow. And those nations who are left out without friends may find it more and more difficult to pursue their developmental goals and even gain technologies to make sure that their development is sustainable. And so one example that I wanted to illustrate is the emergence of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is challenged by the Belt and Road Initiative of China. So if you join the Belt and Road Initiative, then yes, you're part of that culture and you can experience friend shoring. If China sees you as a friend, then China will be investing in you, and so you will be tied with that investment, not just through mutual interdependence, but also the assumption that you are friends and sort of quasi allies. It could even turn into security arrangements later. So these are the trends that I think we are moving towards: minilateralism, friendshoring, and Indo-Pacific. I am aware of the time, Chairperson, so I'm going to now go to my last slide. But before I go to my last slide, I want to take a small commercial break and introduce your audience to a book called Islam and Good Governance that I wrote. I would like your friends and students and faculty to Google it and read it. And there are many videos about it, many talks that I have given, including in Indonesia, on issues of Islam and good governance, where I discuss most of these issues that I'm talking about today. So finally, if you look at, these are the Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has identified. I feel that given the disruption that is taking place in the world today, countries will have to consolidate those goals, come down from 17 to maybe 5, prioritize them, and rethink how they will achieve these goals in the new global context. So instead of saying that I will work with the UN to achieve these goals, I will work with 3 or 4 allies who are nearby, whom I can trust. And if I develop supply chain dependence with them, they will not be disrupted. So you will have to rethink your developmental goals and how you plan to achieve them in the context of the new global realities and the new global trends that I have identified. So I am extremely grateful once again to Malikussaleh University for inviting me to share my views. I hope you find them interesting, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.